He sat in the silence of the night, watching the fireflies bounce from one grass blade to the next. The moment was unbearable and he needed it to be broken. He wanted her to walk up behind him and wrap her arms around his shoulders. That would be a pleasant surprise and everything would return to the way it was. But he knew that would never happen. He just wanted her right there next to him. Her head rested on his chest, humming that haunting melody of the first song they heard together. He remembered that day as he watched the darkness of the sky consume any remnant of blue. They had held hands and walked down the beach right beside the shoreline. Her skirt fluttered in the wind and her hair danced around her shoulders. She was so full of life that day, pulling his arm around her waist every time the waves drew the water closer to them. His heart raced when she did that, but he'd never admit that to her. If he did, she might stop doing it, and he'd never want that. From the speakers of a cafe they passed came the sound of a melody they would never forget. From that moment on, she hummed it softly whenever he made her happy. He cleared his head and lifted himself off the ground. He had been yanking blades of grass from the earth without realizing it. It was months since he ended it, and he needed to stop reminiscing. It just wasn't worth it. He was angry with himself for regretting his own decision. She was great, and he loved her, but he had convinced himself that she never returned the same amount of love. She hurt him in more ways than one, and he had had enough. Ending it was the right thing to do. He hated the fact that she acted so surprised, the shock on her face when he had gone to her to end it all. He paced back and forth, rubbing the back of his neck in frustration. Why did he even care anymore? Why did he miss her so much? She was the reason he had been so miserable. She was flawless, and when she kissed him, adrenaline rushed through his entire body and his heart raced ecstatically. But why did it feel just as good ending it? Everyone around him became so angry with him when he ended it. Why did they even care? It was none of their business. It was just between him and her. They drove him crazy with guilt and made him feast on the bitter taste of depression. He had tried to explain to them that it was for the best, but not even her mother would understand. She couldn't understand how much her daughter had put him through, and how much pain she had caused him. He sat back down in the grass, letting the silence tap at his eardrums. Was he crazy for feeling this way? He began pulling at the blades of grass again, not as softly as he had pulled before. The broken blades of grass were scattered around him, even all over his pants. He dug his fingers into the soil frantically. Please, come back. Please. Tears rushed down his cheeks. He could taste the salty tears on his lips as he continued digging furiously. Blue and red filled the skies behind him. All he could see were his tears and the blood streaming out of his fingers and onto the dry soil of the earth. The sirens were a distant hum for him. They were still after him? After all this time, why did they care so much if he ended it? She was just a girl, and it just wasn't working out between them. He had to end it. Of all people, you'd think her mother would understand. When he'd ended it, he didn't put her through as much pain as she had made him suffer. When he'd ended it, it was quick. No pain. She should have been thankful. Why was she so shocked that day? To end something like that, you'd have to break a person's heart. You just have to. You have the right to remain silent. Still, just a hum in the background to him. He continued digging. You have been charged with the murder of Emily Stockland. He hummed that melody to himself. She should have thanked him for ending it. He had told her he would die for her. Why wouldn't she do the same for him? I put the address in the GPS because I couldn't remember the name of the place, and immediately felt anxious when it reported that I would arrive 10 minutes later than the agreed time. At least I wasn't still fumbling to get ready. I just needed to start driving. Maybe some speeding here and there would buy me some time. I hated being late, but somehow I consistently found myself walking into a room of, "Hey, glad you could finally make it." I hadn't been to this restaurant before. It had its grand opening 2 weeks ago apparently, and it was a hit. People were lined up around the block waiting for their doors to open. I, personally, don't think that says much about a place. We live in such a boring, uneventful town that going to a new food spot is the only thing to do around here. I feel bad for the businesses that fall for it, because in a matter of a few months, they're old news and everyone's just waiting for the next new eatery. Anyways, I mostly say this to admit that I wasn't sure what parking was going to look like. So, the 10-minute late arrival could end up being much worse. I turned the radio on to listen to my favorite playlist to calm my nerves. Since I was taking mostly back roads, I rolled down the windows too to air out the sweat puddling up in every crease on my body. I got a few lucky moments of, it's a yellow light, but just speed up and get past it. Not having to be stuck in those potential red lights earned me some minutes back.
Take a right into the parking lot. Then, you will arrive at your destination.
My GPS was being extra helpful today. There were plenty of spots in the parking lot close to the entrance. This town must already be over this new restaurant. I parked quickly and ran inside. If I'd been early, I would have sat in my car for a while and given myself a pep talk to soothe my nerves, but there wasn't any time for that. I spotted her right away, seeing that the restaurant was pretty empty. There wasn't anyone at the hostess stand, luckily, so I bypassed it and went straight to the table. "I'm sorry for keeping you waiting," I said as I approached and started taking my coat off to hang it on the back of the chair. She looked up and smiled, flipping the page of the menu in her hands. "Don't worry about it. This menu's like a book. I'm not the best at making decisions, so I've just been sitting here reading." I could already tell she was perfect. All my anxiety melted away as I sat down and pulled the chair up. I picked up the menu quickly to see what she was talking about. It was heavy and had several laminated pages between its hardcover exterior. "Thank you for understanding," I said, flipping through the menu. "Sheesh, you weren't joking. Did you find anything that caught your eye?" I actually was torn between the honey-glazed salmon or the herb-encrusted chicken. She looked up and nodded, gesturing for what caught my eye. Those do sound like pretty good options," I said, feeling completely overwhelmed and looking for an easy answer. "What if I order the salmon, you order the chicken, and we can split them and try each other's?" "That sounds like a great compromise to me," she piped up, seemingly thrilled to have that over with. We put our menus down on the table, the universal sign for "we're ready to order now." And I started asking her a list of questions I'd been practicing from multiple online searches for first date questions. She was very responsive to my interrogation, and she was great about reciprocating. My "what do you do for a living?" was met with an answer, and "how about you? What do you do for a living?" She was scoring high on my rubric. It felt very warm and cozy, like we had the whole restaurant to ourselves. I hoped the food was good. Sometimes when a place isn't busy, the food ends up not being as fresh. I could certainly tell, based on the lack of service, that the staff was not interested in dealing with only 2 people. I didn't see a single staff member. They were probably back in the kitchen, playing with their phones to pass the time. I was so engaged in the conversation, I didn't notice the time fly by. Since I showed up late, I wasn't going to be the first one to complain that we hadn't been asked for our orders yet. I figured she would bring it up once she noticed, and I would get up and do something about it. That would impress her for sure. "I'm sorry, could you excuse me for a moment? I've been drinking water this whole time. I'll be right back." She placed her napkin on the table and headed toward the restroom sign near the bar area of the restaurant. I pulled out my phone and busied myself while she was away. Between checking different apps on my phone, I looked around the restaurant again to see if I could spot anyone else. Another customer, a staff member to take our order. Unfortunately, there was no one else. I let her choose the place for us to meet, and it made sense that she wanted to try the new place in town, but their service was pathetic. No wonder there weren't any other customers. She walked back over, sat down, and put the napkin back on her lap. She took a sip of water and said, "I hope you don't mind, but I went ahead and put our order in at the bar. As I was passing to go to the restroom, someone behind the bar asked if we were ready to order. Since I knew what we wanted, I just went ahead and let him know." "That's great. It's nice to know that there's actually someone working back there. Thank you for doing that," I responded, relieved to be expecting food soon. My habit of being late is strongly tied to my lack of time management, so I hadn't had breakfast or lunch, and now it was past 6 p.m. I was starving. The adrenaline of meeting a beautiful woman at a restaurant was keeping me from completely collapsing into my chair from exhaustion. I started the questions back up again, trying to learn as much as I could about her. She mentioned that she'd had a rough childhood and had lost a lot of loved ones around the age of 5. She said she didn't remember much about it, almost like she'd wiped it out of her memory. But sometimes bits and pieces crept back up into her mind. What brought her comfort was playing pretend as a kid, as if those people were still around. She would invite them to tea parties and pretend dinners. She squinted her eyes and smiled, as if she were looking at the memories themselves in the distance. I would invite them, and they would always show up, and that made me feel like I didn't really lose them. It brought me a ton of comfort, you know? I smiled and nodded. I felt bad that she had to go through that, and having imaginary friends as a kid was nothing new to me. For me though, they were never loved ones. They were usually characters from TV or made-up kids. Hers were definitely unique in the sense that they were family members and grown. But I've never been through a traumatic event like that, so I had no way of gauging how normal that was. She seemed to appreciate that I understood and didn't judge her. We went on with our conversation, exploring our hobbies and her dreams. I shared mine with her. Again, the time flew by. It was great that they'd taken our order, but it was weird that our food was still not out. Just as I was thinking that though, she turned her head to the left and smiled. Her eyes moved slowly to the right, as if following something moving in for a landing on the table in front of her. She clapped her hands and smiled. She looked up at me and said, "Wow, this was worth the wait, wasn't it?" I could feel my smile turn immediately to concern. I watched her grab a fork and knife. She pushed the fork into the tablecloth and glided the knife along the back of the fork. "Go ahead and cut yours in half so we can try each other's dish." I looked down at the bare red tablecloth in front of me. "I actually haven't got my food yet," I said, trying to play along while still keeping my sanity. "Ah, you're being silly. Your salmon looks so good. I should have just gone with salmon. I totally understand if you just want to keep it all to yourself." She pretended to cut a small piece of her chicken and put the fork in her mouth. She chewed slowly, closing her eyes adoringly, and said, "Never mind, this chicken is great." I looked around again, starting to realize what was happening. I smiled nervously and said, "Hey, could you give me a moment? I like to wash my hands before I eat." "Sure, no problem," she said. I got up and walked quickly to the restroom. No one was behind the bar as I passed it. Every table that I passed was empty. I pulled my phone out and looked up the restaurant. They were closed on Sundays. Today was Sunday. I tried to calm myself down. It wasn't a big deal. She's not a murderer. She just broke into this place and now I'm with her. So I'll get in trouble too. Great. She seemed to be stuck in that traumatic moment in her life, and being the empathetic person that I am, I understood how hard that must be for her. I told myself that I would go back there and tell her that something came up, that I got a call and needed to run. Maybe we could get together some other time. Okay, I think that'll work. Let's do that. I started walking back. Strangely, I heard a muffled sound coming from behind the bar. But I wasn't about to stay in that place any longer. I watched her pretending to eat her chicken as I approached. I started to grab my jacket. "Hey, so I was in the restroom and I got this urgent call from my sister. She needs to get to the hospital. I need to run over there and help her." She looked up at me and with a sarcastic tone said, "Oh no. Can't she call an ambulance? You know how expensive those can be. I'm the closest to her house, so I think it's best I go help her. Let's do this again soon," I said nervously. "That's what they always say. Let's put you off for later. We'll spend time with you later." And then they never do. Her voice became deep and raspy in that moment. "Yesterday, I asked the staff here if they'd play pretend with me, and they said no. Now, I'm asking you to play pretend, and you're saying no. Wait, I'm not saying no. I just need to run and help my sister," I said, slowly turning away from her and walking toward the main door. As I reached for the metal handle of the door, I felt something powerful and metal slap against the back of my head. Then, everything went black. "My favorite color is yellow, actually," I heard her voice say, followed by a giggle. My head was throbbing as I pried my eyes open. I watched colorful spots appear on top of the blurred image of her sitting at the table. I looked down and saw that my ankles and arms were bound up in rope. She had me leaning up against a bar near the bathroom. I heard the muffled noise again. I quickly peeked my head around the bar, and there they were, staff members in black aprons, bound and gagged. They were the staff members that probably denied her pretend request yesterday when the restaurant was open. Probably the closing crew, since there weren't very many of them. Now I was questioning what actually happened to her family when she was 5. But how was she able to overpower all of these people? I know my mistake was turning my back to her and not getting out of there fast enough, but a small group of people? I looked back at the table and there was my answer. Sitting near her pretend plate was a gun. I bet that's what she used to knock me out moments ago. I could see her throw her head back with an empty wine glass in her hand, point to where I had been sitting before and say, "Max, you're so funny." I forgot to mention earlier, but my name is Max.